This episode of The History Guy is brought to you by Incogni. Today it's fairly easy to view a picture of the Earth on which we live, photographs taken by astronauts in outer space. And of course we have globes and maps that show us every corner of the world on which we live. But the level of certainty that we feel about our planet's geography is a relatively new thing. In historical terms, relatively recently, there were blank spots on that map, places where the unknown and the incredible might still exist. In 1906, a famed explorer offered a piece of information about our globe that would lead to an expedition into some of the harshest conditions in the world in order to seek out a new land where explorers hoped that undiscovered treasures of science might still exist. It's history that deserves to be remembered. Boy, time sure flies. It's been more than a year since I signed up with Incogni now, and I've sure seen a reduction in those spam emails. Those things have been plaguing me for years, and it's such a pleasure to see my inbox clean again. There's so many of those shadowy data collection organizations out there collecting some of your most personal information, things like your social security number, your shopping habits, often without you knowing it, and then selling it online. But Incogni is a data removal tool that is as relentless as they are. It tracks down those shady organizations that are collecting your data and enforces your right to protect your privacy by requiring them to take your data down. Now, you can try to do that yourself, but it'll take hours, and you might not know how to deal with their objections and make them comply. Incogni is an essential tool in the data age. In the last year, Incogni's had my data removed from 247 sites, saving me more than 185 hours of effort, making me and my data more secure. And I can see that because Incogni gives me this handy dashboard to show how very much they've helped to make spam just a bit of forgotten history. Thank you so much to the good folks at Incogni who have been sponsoring episodes of The History Guy for a year now. Go to incogni.com/thehistoryguy and use the code TheHistoryGuy to get a special offer of 60% off an annual plan. That's incogni.com/thehistoryguy. Use the code TheHistoryGuy, or go ahead and use the link in the description and take your data off the market. Like me, you'll be so glad you did. According to his book, Nearest the Pole, on June 24th, 1906, explorer and naval officer Robert Peary crested a hill never before explored by Europeans. Earlier that day, he had written in his journal, "I felt this was an opportunity not to be lost, as the elevation would enable me to see what there was beyond." He would dub the 2,000-foot-tall peak Cape Colgate, after financial backer James Colgate. "The view was more than interesting," he wrote. Using binoculars, he looked towards the northwest, and there he spied a line of snow-clad hills over the Arctic ice. Undiscovered land. 3 days later, he crested another hilltop, which he dubbed Cape Thomas Hubbard, and spied the land again. He didn't have time to explore it, but he did name it Crocker Land, after yet another expedition backer. The land was something of a consolation prize. He had failed, on his 7th journey to the Arctic, to reach the North Pole. This story would lead 7 years later to a journey to find that far-off land, which promised new discoveries to a world that seemed to be running out of them. For much of history, humans wondered what lay at the far-off ends of the Earth, like the North Pole. Even the humans and cultures that lived furthest north still lived hundreds of miles away from 90 degrees north. In the 16th century, Flemish mapmaker Gerardus Mercator published the first version of the now famous Mercator projection, which he made to improve ship navigation. Because the Mercator projection distorts the areas near the poles, he included an inset that showed the North Pole as he guessed it would look like. At the very center was a huge black rock, surrounded by a whirlpool and 4 great continents. Much of this came from a now-lost book, the Inventio Fortunato, which describes the journey of an English minor friar of Oxford and his journey via magical arts into the far north beyond Norway. It wasn't until the 19th century that European explorers tried to reach the pole. Among the first was Sir William Parry in 1827. At the end of the century, Robert Parry made his first attempt to travel north across Greenland. It was on his 1905 expedition that he sighted Crocker Land. There was reason to believe that an undiscovered land existed in the Arctic. Parry had sighted animal tracks hundreds of miles from any known landmass, and some of the northern tribes told stories of other islands. Roland A. Harris, an expert in ocean tides with the U.S. Geodetic and Coastal Survey, penned an article in National Geographic in 1904 titled "Some Indications of a Land in the Vicinity of the North Pole." Harris thought a continent explained unexpectedly low levels of tidal activity and the known route of polar currents. Parry wanted the North Pole, however, As soon as he returned, he began fundraising for another expedition, writing George Crocker that "you will note that I have attached your name to the distant new land observed by me." Crocker responded that he could do nothing for you in your next trip to the North Pole. Still, Perry used the continent as an advertising tool, hinting that he might explore it after reaching the pole. In 1908, he went on his final expedition and claimed to reach the pole on April 6, 1909. When Perry returned, he learned that another explorer, Frederick Cook, claimed to have reached the pole first in April of 1908. The claims reached newspapers at almost the same time, sparking an acrimonious debate. Perry declared that Cook had sold the public a gold brick. In December, the University of Copenhagen determined Cook's records did not prove that he reached the pole. The New York Times printed opinions from all over the country, which dubbed Cook a fugitive mountebank and a mammoth rascal. Perry's records were given to the National Geographic Society, which credited Perry with the discovery but allowed no third-party analysis. Two of the men on Perry's pole trip planned to go back to explore Crocker Land. They were Donald McMillan and George Borup. McMillan, 34, had been a teacher at a boarding school before he volunteered for the expedition. Borup was 23, a Yale graduate working in the mechanical department of the Pennsylvania Railroad when he became a last-minute addition to Perry's team. Reaching the unexplored continent promised legendary status, and as a bonus it would prove Cook to be a fraud, since his claimed path took him right past Crocker Land and he claimed to see nothing. They found it difficult to raise money for the expedition. Perry's support was lukewarm at best, and finally Borup found support at the American Museum of Natural History. Edmund Otis Hovey, geological curator for the museum, saw Borup as a promising protege. The museum announced its sponsorship of the trip on May 13, 1911, and then tragedy struck. Borup drowned in a canoeing accident. The expedition was postponed and reorganized, expanding to 7 scientists with multiple goals. Besides finding Crocker Land, they planned to explore Greenland's interior, to search for undiscovered islands, and to do as much science as possible. The team was ready to depart aboard the Diana on July 2, 1913. Along with McMillan, the team included Jonathan Jott Small as cook, carpenter, and mechanic, Dr. Elmo Ekblaw, a geology professor, Navy Ensign Fitzhugh Green, 25, meant as a right-hand man for McMillan, 22-year-old Jerome Allen, radio operator, Dr. Maurice Tanqueray, zoologist, and Dr. Harrison Hunt, surgeon. They didn't have an auspicious start. 2 weeks in, the Diana ran aground, forcing them to charter a new ship, and they sighted Greenland only on August 15th. As they traveled north, they collected a large number of Inuit with their sledges and dogs, who would be vital for the expedition's survival. Their goal was to reach Etta, the northernmost settlement of the Greenlandic Inuit, and from there they would cross Smith Sound and reach Ellesmere Island. But they arrived late and were forced to winter in Etta. They built Borup Lodge at Etta, complete with a generator and electricity. Their radio, however, was useless, as the Canadian government had failed to build a promised receiver. They began setting up caches ahead of their intended path in December 1913. In February, with a large team of Inuit, McMillan, Green, Ekblaw, Tank, and Hunt made for their first attempt to find Crocker Land. It was a disaster. One night, sleeping on the ice, McMillan awoke to find his pillow aflame and spent several terrifying minutes rolling in the snow. "A bit too close," he wrote in his journal. They only made it 100 miles before the Inuit decided to turn back. The pemmican, a paste of dried meat vital for Arctic exploration, was oversalted and made the dogs sick. They tried again on March 11th, this time with only Mac, Green, and Ekblaw, though Ekblaw soon returned with frostbitten feet. From Ellesmere, they crossed the ice to Axel Heiberg Island, where Perry had seen Crocker Land from Cape Thomas Hubbard. Mac sent home several Inuit, leaving only himself, Green, and 2 Inuit, Itukashu and Piawato. They failed to find Cape Thomas Hubbard, but ventured onto the ice in the direction of Crocker Land on April 16th. The ice of the Arctic Sea is not smooth, but a chaos of constantly moving ice, with lumpy hillocks and sharp pressure ridges that rise 30 feet or more above the ice. Perry described the terrain as indescribable chaos. Mac said he felt like an ant in an ice cream freezer. It is sometimes broken by leads, where the ice is cracked and open water prevents passage. On April 17th, McMillan tried sounding the depth using piano wire. He lowered it for 300 fathoms without finding a bottom, a worrying sign, as water that deep usually meant there was no land nearby. 2 days later, McMillan wrote that we hoped to make landfall in the next few days. They could see nothing as a dense fog lay over the ice. They encountered first one lead and then another, and having to wait at each for the water to freeze back over again. On April 21st, with the mist dissipating, Mac awoke to Green shouting, "We've got it!" There it was, plain as day, McMillan wrote. hills, valleys, and an ice cap, a tremendous land extending through 150 degrees of horizon. The Inuit, however, shook their heads. It was a mirage caused by the mist, but the Americans refused to believe them. For the next 3 days, they pushed over tortured and broken ice, a crushed-up, chaotic mess. And on April 23rd, the Americans climbed a pressure ridge where they could see for miles in every direction. There was no land. "We were on the brown spot on the map that had covered our distance," Macmillan wrote. They turned back to cross the 150 miles to land. Time was of the essence as the weather warmed. The ice moves on the water, and at one point they lost their trail, and the Inuit only found it again with difficulty. On April 28th, they reached Cape Thomas Hubbard and made the difficult climb to the cairn that Perry had left there. They retrieved his note, proving Perry had been there. Macmillan believed they could still accomplish something of value, and the force split into 2 groups, 1 American and 1 Inuit each, to find another cairn and note. Macmillan went east to reach Cape Colgate and another of Perry's notes, while Greene went west to find a note which claimed Axel Heiberg Island for Norway. It would have been simple, but a blizzard hit the same day. Macmillan abandoned his plan to reach Colgate, instead reaching the rendezvous point and waiting for Greene. It was only on May 4th, 6 days later, that he saw a sledge approaching. Things had gotten worse for Greene. Despite the storm, he was determined to retrieve the note until Piawato refused to go farther. Greene's dog team had died in the storm, but becoming paranoid, he refused to ride on the Inuit's sledge. Instead, he followed on foot and became convinced that Piawato was trying to leave him behind. He caught up and retrieved a rifle, ordering the Inuit to keep behind him. According to Greene's diary, Piawato soon began driving away from me. Greene opened fire. First, he fired a warning shot, but the Inuit kept going. Then Greene shot him in the shoulder or chest, and he fell from the sledge. Greene caught up and found the man unconscious. In another version, Greene fired twice more into the body. Macmillan judged Greene's actions a deliberate murder and complained that he would rather freeze both feet than shoot one of the best Eskimos he had ever had. But he couldn't risk telling the truth to the other Inuit. Greene pantomimed an avalanche, claiming only he had survived. The rest of the way back would have been fatal without Itukashu, who hunted caribou and repaired igloos. He even fitted the sledge with a sail to move more quickly on the ice. On May 21st, they reached Borup Lodge. Macmillan told the other Americans what had happened. Hunt was furious. Hunt thought Greene did not consider it murder because he was just a savage. He hated the idea of living with a man who had killed my friend. Piawato's wife gave birth on June 29th. She named the boy Peter. Throughout the summer, Greene descended into a kind of madness. He slept when the others were awake, wrote letters to an unknown woman named Anna, whom he often called Dan, and obsessively built igloos. They sent letters for a relief ship to come in the summer of 1915, but while they were exploring, the world had descended into World War I. The museum managed to charter a ship in April 1915, and Hovey, who headed the Crocker Land Committee, went along. The ship was in poor condition, however, and running late, and was finally ready to sail for Greenland in late July. A cold summer in Greenland meant food was hard to come by, and supplies were running perilously low. Often sick, the amount of science getting done was almost nil. Most of the American team were fed up with Macmillan, who continued to trade precious supplies for fox skins to keep the natives happy and defray the expedition's cost. On September 14th, it seemed rescue had arrived when Hovey's relief ship appeared, but things quickly turned when the ship was unable to leave. The Americans, now reinforced with Hovey and Comer, an ice pilot hired by the museum, were not getting along. Hovey berated Macmillan for the disastrous expedition, and Greene was reviled and secluded. Several of the Americans set out by sledge to reach southern Greenland, but only Tanqueray managed to reach a port. He sailed to Denmark and there helped the museum hire another ship at the outrageous cost of $35,000. And that ship failed to reach Etah. Tank went home, reaching the U.S. on June 21st, 1916. Allen, Greene, and Hunt would each follow his footsteps. Hovey left Etah by sledge on March 24th, 1917, to reach the United States again in August. On July 31st, 1917, Macmillan finally sighted a ship. The museum had finally sent the right ship, an Arctic veteran called Neptune, and the right captain, Robert Bartlett, who had been with Peary on the 1908 expedition. On August 4th, they left Borup Lodge behind for the last time. On the way south, they picked up Ekblah, who had attempted to leave on his own but ended up stranded due to illness. The 4 of them arrived back in the United States at the end of August. By most accounts, the expedition was a failure. Little science had been done, and only a small amount of geography, apart from the erasure of Crocker Land. When asked what the most important thing to come out of the expedition was, Macmillan answered, "I suppose it was our securing 2 complete sets of knots eggs." Dr. Hunt was credited with finding the eggs, which confirmed the red knots breeding range in the polar Arctic. Scientifically important, but hardly exciting for the papers. The museum had spent $192,580.11, more than $5.1 million in 2024 dollars, and was $80,000, or $2.1 million adjusted for inflation, in the red. The various members of the party mostly went on with their lives afterwards, and few of them ever saw each other again. Macmillan continued to go to the Arctic, making several dozen more trips in his life. Green never showed remorse for the murder. He later wrote that after he killed Piuato, he had something of that gratification of sense. A moment before he had faced the end of everything, and now I beheld the beginning. He went on, I gloated over my victory, not the man. He, like myself, was but a pawn in this game of the gods. So what was Crocker land? Well, Macmillan and other Perry adherents tend to believe that it had to have been a mirage like the ones that they'd seen, but that doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. When Perry returned from his expedition, he didn't mention Crocker land in any of his correspondence. It wasn't in the original draft of his book, only in the final copy. When you look at his journal for those days, he says no land sighted. When Macmillan proved that it didn't exist, Perry gave kind of an enigmatic answer. He said, it's almost an axiom in Arctic exploration that one can never really be sure what one has seen until he has put his foot on it. Most historians agree that Crocker land was an invention of Perry in an attempt to get Crocker to invest in his next expedition. And given that lie, it seems rather lucky that the men that went looking for it all returned, except for poor Piuato, who was killed by a man who seems to have cracked under the Arctic pressure. The Crocker land expedition came at the end, the tail end of the age of exploration. It straddled the era of the First World War, which itself changed the world in magnificent ways, ushering in an era of machines and modernity. Maybe it's fitting that it was that expedition that finally put an end to the belief that there was some undiscovered land or people in the far reaches of the Arctic. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.